Good evening and welcome everyone. Welcome to a new virtual semester for most of us, and welcome to the first virtual event of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. My name is Ruth von Bernus and I'm the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. Before we start today's event, let me say how deeply disturbed we are by the racist and anti-Semitic messaging associated with the recent break-in at the Campus Y building. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, which commemorates that 76 years ago, Auschwitz was liberated. Recent events show how much we need to continue to create and offer academic content that addresses anti-Semitism, not only in our world's history, but also in current times and even on our own campus. Today, you will meet graduate students and recent graduate students who all work on research on the Shoah and its aftermath. I'm grateful that Karen Auerbach has gathered this group and will moderate the event. Karen is an associate professor and the Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt Scholar in Jewish History in UNC's Department of History. She has published widely on the Shoah. Her first book, published in 2013, is a microhistory of Jewish families who were neighbors in an apartment building in Warsaw after the Holocaust. It explores the reconstruction of communities and identifications in post-war Poland. She also edited a book on genocide, memory, and history, and we will send you the link in the chat. Please let me welcome Karen to our event, The Holocaust, Jewish History and Memory, New Directions in Research. And what we will do now, we will go through the different talks of the students, and as I said, Karen will moderate the event. And if you have questions, just please, we will have some time at the end of the event to answer them all. So please, Karen, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. And thank you for inviting us all to speak and for initiating this event and for your kind introduction. And thank you to all of our graduate students for agreeing to share their research in your talks today. Today marks the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army on January 27th, 1945. And in that same year, after surviving the Holocaust in hiding in the Lviv region, and while still living in Poland, the Polish Jewish historian Philip Friedman, in his capacity as director of the Central Jewish Historical Commission in Poland, laid out a comprehensive, detailed plan for research about the genocide of European Jewry. Mere months after the liberation of Auschwitz, he identified 122 areas of research under 6 headings. What struck me in Friedman's research plan is how thoroughly he anticipated the unfolding of the study of the Holocaust in the past 3/4 of a century since he wrote it. Some of the topics he outlined, including the history of anti-Semitism, the decision-making process for genocide, the role of the Judenrat, and others, have gone through numerous phases of examination and re-examination, and others that he identified, such as family life among Jews under Nazi rule, folk songs and folklore, the collaboration of non-Jewish populations in areas under Nazi occupation, have only become subjects of more extensive research in recent years and decades. Philip Friedman and other Holocaust survivors, some of them trained as historians before the war, as Friedman was, and others who pursued historical research for the first time after the war, began documenting and evaluating the genocide immediately after war's end, decades before the field of Holocaust studies developed in English in the 1960s. His generation of historians was the first to serve in the role of keepers of memory of the past, challengers to memory, complicators of memory. The doctoral students who will be speaking today about their research are the next generation of historians to follow in those roles. And of course, our goals are not exactly the same as in Friedman's generation, who were often motivated as much by the desire for commemoration as by scholarly aims. Our pursuit as historians is to understand and make sense of the past, but we too, as today, end up also serving in the role of memory keepers, challengers, and complicators. The passage of time has, of course, led to new areas of research, from the significance of gender to the collection of Holocaust testimonies, to cite just a few examples. Other research has examined the Holocaust in the context of other genocides in order to understand both common patterns that lead to genocide, as well as the specificities of the genocide of European Jews. And many historians have taken up Saul Friedlander's call to develop an integrated history of the Holocaust, one that bridges the divide between perpetrator and victim history. The talks you will hear today can also be situated in the context of efforts to bridge another divide, the divide between the study of the Holocaust and the study of Jewish history before the Second World War. The Holocaust can only be understood by situating it within the broader trajectory of Jewish history, just as it must be situated within the longer narrative of German history and European history more broadly. So with that in mind, the talks today are divided into three themes. The first, integration and identity. The second, Jewish responses to persecution and genocide. And the third, memory and commemoration of the Holocaust and the Jewish past. And just to reiterate Ruth's opening comment, please feel free to post comments in the chat session, and we will monitor those. And at the very end of all of the talks, we will bring up those questions. Okay. So the research of our first two speakers, in fact, challenges the chronology that divides the Nazi period from what came before. Both Max Lazar in his research on Jewish integration in Frankfurt and Robin Buller in her research on Jews from the Ottoman Empire in France focus on questions of integration and identity among European Jews, both before and during the Nazi period. Okay, so first we have Max Lazar, who is the Goodman Dissertation Fellow at the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. Max specializes in modern German, Jewish, German, and urban history. This spring, he will defend his dissertation titled Jerusalem on the Main, a local study of Jewish integration in Frankfurt between 1914 and 1938. Before coming to UNC, he was a Fulbright teaching assistant in Vienna and a fellow at the American Jewish Committee's office in Berlin. And I should just say that all of our students are supported in their research with grants from the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and I thank both the center and the supporters of the center for making that possible. I think what I'll do is I'll also introduce Robin and then turn things over to Max. Robin Buller is a dissertation completion fellow at the Association for Jewish Studies and previously received a Saul Kagan Fellowship in Advanced Shoah Studies from the Claims Conference, among other fellowships. She is currently a lecturer at Sonoma State University, and next year will be a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. She will defend her dissertation titled Sephardi Immigrants in Paris, Navigating Community, Culture, and Identity Between France and the Ottoman Empire, 1918 to 1939, also this spring. So welcome, Max and Robin.
All right, well, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Karen. It's great to be here. Thank you all so much for coming out to this very, very important event. Before I dive into my presentation, just a brief little content warning at the start. You may hear some strange sounds and squawking in the background. That's because I am in a one-bedroom apartment with a 2-month-old. So I will try my best to make sure that we don't have those noises interfere with things, but best laid plans often can run afoul in these situations with small children. So I'll start sharing my screen. I have a PowerPoint for this right here under the sort of heading of Jewish Integration Reconsidered for this talk. So Robin is the other person amongst this group of graduate students who I know best as far on a personal level, my work as well too. And we're both sort of getting towards something that Karen addressed at the start right here about trying to understand with our work about how the Holocaust really fits into the longer arc of the history of Jewish life. How do we sort of see this fitting into some kind of larger narrative of Jewish history? And a great piece that I read a few years ago by the scholar Samuel Moyn, he was writing about German Jewish history, and he referred to the fact that this is often a history that is sort of written as a history under the sign of the apocalypse, that this very tragic ending of the Holocaust always seems to be very readily apparent and present in any kind of a work of Jewish history that you look at about Jewish life in Germany, such as the work to the right here by Amos Alon, The Pity of It All. The title sort of says it all right there. World War I, more often than not, is depicted as a kind of negative turning point or even a prelude to destruction. So with my project, which I'll explain sort of very briefly in the rest of the presentation, a guiding question that I'm working with is, to what extent did World War I actually halt Jewish integration in its tracks in Germany, as well as other parts of Europe. To sort of get to the meaning of this phrase integration very quickly, I'll take, my cues here from the scholar Till van Roden, who in his really great local study about Jewish life in the city of Breslau in the late imperial period in Germany, writes that integration can best be understood as, quote, the processes of inclusion in the central functional spheres of modern society, so economy, politics, science, education, and law, as well as in everyday life. So what I'm doing in my dissertation is that I am looking at this matter of integration from the local level of Frankfurt and sort of using local history as a means of challenging some kind of a master narrative that sees everything sort of leading up directly to the Holocaust. So sort of challenging this teleology, just sort of speak to the reason why Frankfurt is a city that I'm working with right here. It was the city with the second largest Jewish population in Germany, with Jews accounting for roughly 6% of the city's population. And also, if you actually dive in and take a look at the Jewish community in this city, it's amazing for the level of pluralism that it has. So rather than sort of fitting into this sort of, I think, stereotypical notion that we have of sort of hyper assimilated German Jews that have barely any kind of connection to their Jewishness as a religion, we really can see the full spectrum of Jewish life ranging from Reform to modern Orthodox in a place like Frankfurt. So in this dissertation, I take a look at these different areas of integration. I'm just going to highlight two of them, sort of looking at this period from 1914 to 1933 here. If we look at an area like politics, for example, this is already a direct challenge to this notion that World War I heralded some kind of major shift, because Jewish integration really seemed to deepen to a very large degree in local politics. We can see the presence of Jewish members on the city council. 1918, this revolution that comes in after the First World War. It's a moment when women are first able to serve in elected office in Germany. We have two Jewish women that are on the city council, Henrietta Fürth as well as Toni Sender. These folks are spanning the political spectrum from socialists to conservatives as well. We even have a Jewish mayor of the city from 1924 until March of 1933. So right up until sort of the bitter end of democracy in the Weimar Republic. Another area I take a look at as well too is public education. The fact that this was really a sphere, a kind of space that promoted tolerance and integration of Jews in the city. So on one level, we have the fact that we have rabbis and other Jewish religion teachers working as full members of faculty at schools in the city. The fact that they are working directly to actually set the tone for what the culture is at individual institutions of learning, such as high schools, even working on the exam committees for graduating seniors that are preparing to go on to university. Something I found is that we had the creation of a kind of interesting tolerance library at one of these schools that is the work of one local rabbi who is trying to actively reach across the religious divide and to, sort of educate Christian students more about what Judaism is all about. Beyond this, too, if we look at the actual curriculum in schools, we can see that in literature classes, both in German and in English, we have teachers that are working with texts that directly sort of probe these larger discourses about tolerance, integration. Just one little interesting tidbit that I found is the fact that Merchant of Venice is a very popular text in a lot of these schools. We have one teacher at a school that's known for having a particularly sort of conservative nationalist reputation, asking his students directly in an essay prompt, how can you look at this play and show me that this is some kind of an expression of anti-Semitism? All right, so then, what happens post-1933? I think this can be summed up very well in the words of the famous German Jewish diarist Victor Klemperer, who himself wrote on March 12th of 1933, again, it's astounding how easily everything collapses. Things really change overnight in Frankfurt. This incredibly tolerant city becomes very quickly a bastion of Nazi power. The Nazis win 44% of the local vote. This is a little bit more than the share in national elections in March of 1933. Jews are immediately purged from politics. All this progress I talked about from 1918 onwards evaporates overnight. We see Nazi ideology entering into the school curriculum. Students are more likely to read a text by Hitler than they are to read by an Enlightenment author such as Lessing, who wrote plays such as Nathan the Wise that were advocating for tolerance towards Jews. With the forced retirement and firing of local Jewish artists, teachers, the list goes on, friendships and businesses and relations ended. But another really interesting thing that I've discovered is that we have some curious traces of Jewish integration that remain in place and can't really easily be sort of, dialed back after 1933. I'll highlight the spatial way in which we see something like this. So I have a study where I sort of take a look at local literature about the city, and Jews are still very prominent in works that are basically laying out what Frankfurt is as a place, what its identity as a place. An official history of the city that's published in 1934 describing what Frankfurt went through during the First World War has many kind words for the acts of local Jewish philanthropists, for the actions of the local Jewish community in the course of the war effort. As late as 1937, we have a history textbook about the city that has a very philo-Semitic narrative about the role of Jews in Frankfurt's development into a thriving center of modern trade being distributed to public schools. Additionally, this is something that I talked about for the center back in the fall, we had the presence of Jewish street names around the city, approximately 50 of these scattered all throughout town. And it's especially hard for the city to root these names out because up until years such as 1937, we have local bureaucrats, even local members of the Nazi Party that don't quite think that it is, to use a funny word here, kosher to get rid of some of these Jewish names because they see this as too big of an erasure of Jewish contributions to German and world culture. And these names will not, in fact, fully disappear until 1938. Talking about a few other things right here about sort of this idea of Frankfurt being intertwined with Jewishness. In 1933, the new Nazi mayor of the city, Friedrich Krebs, this great villain-looking character in this photograph right here, very definitively states that Frankfurt will become a German city rather than a Jewish and a Marxist one. In 1935, he tries to christen Frankfurt as the city of German handcrafts, but this labeling doesn't really work. This sort of, if we're speaking from the Nazi perspective, taint of Jewishness remains. And we flash forward to 1939 when we have the 25th anniversary celebration of the founding of the University of Frankfurt in 1939. Every single speech that's talking about the fact that this university is now a Nazi institution can't help but mention the fact that Jews were behind the founding of this institution in the first place. So this longer sort of connection with Jewishness remains in the city despite the best efforts of this new ideological power. So key conclusion then, before I pass this off to Rob, and hopefully I haven't gone too over long right here, is that what I see is that 1914 did not preface 1933 or something like 1941, a year when we see deportations of Jews starting in Frankfurt. More chillingly, though, I think, is the fact that we can see some really major continuities in city administration, the government in the Weimar era and the Third Reich era in Frankfurt, that many of the leaders who in fact worked to promote Jewish integration before 1933 were part of campaigns to dismantle it after 1933. There's just two examples that I cite right here, which is one sort of final point I want to make right here, that if democracy was a precondition for strong integration, we should remember, and I think especially keeping in mind the events of the last month, that democracy, much like integration, much like tolerance, is also something that is incredibly fragile. So thanks, I'll pass it off to Robin.
Wonderful. Let me get my screen share up here. Is everybody able to see it? Fantastic. Excellent talk by Max. I'm always astounded by how much information he's able to fit into a period of 8 minutes. It's really remarkable. So I'll try and make my talk half as rich. But thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you to the Center for Jewish Studies for making this possible, for hosting this Day of Remembrance, and for funding my research and Max's research. So I study a history that isn't particularly known, which is the history of Ottoman Sephardi immigrants in Paris in the first half of the 20th century. And with my dissertation, I really focus on the interwar period and on interwar life. But in my research, I've also found that there are really important connections between the group's experiences of interwar migration and settlement in the 1920s and 1930s, and their experiences of persecution, rescue, and survival during the Second World War and the Holocaust. So I'm going to focus on those particular connections today, because sort of to tie us back to what Karen said in her introduction, by studying this group, I'm not only trying to, fill this gap of Ottoman Sephardi, or just Sephardi in general, history during the Holocaust, I'm also trying to really connect Jewish history and Holocaust history, and to make connections between these major themes that really define modern Jewish history, like migration and citizenship and transnational networks and belonging with what happened during the Nazi genocide. So in the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of Sephardi Jews migrated out of the crumbling Ottoman Empire and its successor states, mostly Greece and Turkey, to build new lives all around the world, in South America, in North America, notably in Seattle and New York, but also in France. And this immigrant group hailed primarily from major Jewish centers in the Ottoman Empire. My map got a little bit moved here. The yellow line is supposed to be under Edirne and Istanbul over here in Salonika and Izmir. But they also came from sort of smaller places like Kavala and Sofia in Bulgaria and Aleppo in Syria. In France, in 1914, they already numbered around 8,000 individuals, and that number grew to closer to 35,000 in 1939 at the outbreak of World War II. In France, they joined hundreds of thousands of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe who had arrived during the same period and who were likewise seeking better lives, escaping persecution, and fleeing poverty. The majority of France's new Ottoman Sephardi immigrants settled in Paris's 11th arrondissement, which came to be called Little Turkey as a result of the many so-called, they called them Oriental restaurants and grocers and textile shops that lined its streets. And here on this slide, I just have a couple images of Sephardi immigrant life in the 11th arrondissement of interwar Paris. But the history of Ottoman Sephardi immigrants in Paris is really distinct from that of Eastern European Jewish immigrants that we know more about in important cultural and legal ways. So the presence of Franco-Jewish educational associations, namely this one institution called the Alliance Israélite Universelle around the Mediterranean basin beginning in the 19th century, made it so that when they arrived in France, most Ottoman Sephardim were already not only familiar with French culture, but fluent in the French language. So to tie us back to the theme of integration that Max was talking about, this really enabled these immigrants to sort of integrate in a more direct and obvious way than their Eastern European counterparts might have been able to. And second, and this is what I'd really like to focus on for the rest of my time today, Ottoman Sephardim often had access to this sort of entity that scholars call extraterritorial privileges. And this really differentiated them legally from other Jews in France. These were legal vestiges of the Ottoman imperial era that offered foreign protection, sort of amorphously, beyond conventional national purviews. So Ottoman Sephardim often carried multiple passports. They were protected subjects of countries like Britain, Italy, Argentina, or Spain, while also carrying forms of passport or subjecthood from Greece, Turkey, or France. So these were really coveted documents that were often not only held at the same time, but were passed on through families. They were inherited. And here I just have one document that sort of shows you what I mean by this. This is an immigrant from Adrianople, from Edirne, today's Edirne, named Marco Rodrigue, who you see is labeled in this document as an Israélite du Levant, Levantine Israelite, but also he's born in Adrianople, and he's a protege of Italy, a protege Italien, so an Italian protected subject. And here are more documents from Marco Rodrigue. We see that he is here listed as Turkish on the left, that's his nationality. But on the right, a year later, his nationality is Ottoman, despite the fact that the Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore in 1929. So this quality really sort of gave them access to different legal options and legal privileges. And this prompts a question that connects the interwar period with World War II, which is, how did these relationships with foreign institutions that originated in the pre-World War II era, even in the Ottoman era, how did extraterritoriality create or limit options for survival during the Holocaust? So for Ottoman Sephardi immigrants in Paris, extraterritoriality, this quality of having access somehow to legal protection from a foreign government, had really lost its significance by the early 1930s. Consulates didn't want to continue to honor agreements made within now defunct empire. But despite its legal obsolescence, during the Second World War, they gained renewed importance. So during the Holocaust in France, Ottoman Sephardim contacted consulates from nations that had promised them protection in the past and evoked their expired passports and protege papers in a new atmosphere of desperation. Consular responses indicate, a really sort of mixed array of reactions that is in line with how we've come to understand the sort of ambiguity of bystander behavior during the Holocaust. So most foreign consulates were really eager to protect the assets of businesses and subjects or potential past subjects. And they intervened to avoid having their businesses or their apartments or commercial enterprises nationalized by France or by occupying German forces. So in that sense, they protected the belongings of these persecuted Sephardi Jews, but only out of a desire to further their own national financial interests. When it came to expatriation, being taken back in by a country or taken in by a country, some consulates, like the Turkish consulate, were really stringent, and they deliberately limited the number of Jews that they expatriated or brought back to Turkey to those who had followed really obscure and convoluted rules of citizenship acquisition after the Turkish Republic was established. And this was really difficult for people who had moved out of Anatolia, emigrated out of the Ottoman Empire when it was still part of the Ottoman Empire. So Turkish authorities in France only repatriated a really small minority of Sephardim who appealed for protection, between 200 and 400 at most, citing a Turkish law that subjects abroad had to register with a consulate within 5 years of 1923, when the Turkish Republic was established. And not surprisingly, most Sephardim didn't know about this rule. It was instituted after they had left. But to end on a more hopeful note, some consulates did go out of their way to rescue Ottoman Sephardim by accepting or sometimes even granting anew extraterritorial claims, at times breaking the law to do so. So a man named Bernardo Roland de Millota, he was the Spanish ambassador in Paris during the first years of World War II. He organized for over 80 Ottoman Sephardi families whose relatives had had access to Spanish protection during the Ottoman era, but who had themselves likely never even set foot on the Iberian Peninsula, to be repatriated to Spain. And this is the repatriation card of Victoria Franco, who was one of those individuals. And on August 10th of 1943, they boarded a train in Perpignan, which is in the south of France, in what was the free zone, destined for Barcelona. And all 304 passengers survived the war. Millota, who had defied orders to save these Jews, was then removed from his post and sent back to Madrid. But while his actions were noble and significant, and they earned him the honor of being considered righteous among the nations, they were also really problematic when we think back on them, because over 2,000 individual Sephardim applied for Spanish repatriation, but only 300 received it. So this quality, this sort of strange entity of extraterritoriality, it could change someone's experience in the Holocaust for the better, but it could also mean nothing. And that, I think, just sort of speaks to the variety of experiences and options and subjectivity of Holocaust experiences. Thank you for listening. I hope I haven't taken up too much time.
Great. Thank you, Max and Robin, for those really interesting talks. It's been wonderful to see your research and dissertations develop over the last years. And I just want to encourage everyone, if you have questions, there's so much that we already have to think about from Max and Robin. If you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat so that as we go along, that you still remember the questions. If I would suggest inserting questions now rather than waiting until later talks. Okay, so I would like to move to the second group of speakers. Our next two speakers focus on Jewish responses to the Holocaust through different lenses and methodologies. The first focusing on Jewish cemeteries through an approach of the study of space, among other methods, and the second examining the role of abortion among Jews under Nazi occupation through the lens of medical history and gender studies. The first speaker is Alison Curry, who received an MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Gratz College and a graduate certificate in Digital Humanities from George Mason University before arriving at UNC. She's participated in seminars at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Grodzka Gate NN Theater Center, a really wonderful cultural center in Lublin, Poland, that does so many creative projects focused on preserving memory of the Holocaust and the Jewish past in Poland. And Alison has also been a fellow in the Digital Humanities Lab at UNC. Her doctoral dissertation is titled Tradition or Necessity, Sanctuary or Sorrow, the Role of the Jewish Cemetery in Interwar and World War II era Poland. And I'll introduce Morgan as well, our second speaker in this group as well. Morgan Morales received MA degrees in History and Jewish Studies at Indiana University, where she was also the recipient of several fellowships. She is a doctoral student in the European History subfield at UNC in the Department of History, and her dissertation is titled A Matter of Life and Death, Jewish Woman Who Chose Abortion During the Holocaust. So welcome, Alison and Morgan.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you for having us. We're looking forward to this. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So I'm going to start my talk today with a little bit of a story. The story is about this couple you see here, this family. So we have Adam and Pella Starkov with their daughter Yasha. Yasha was actually born in the Warsaw Ghetto in January of 1941. But around a year and a half later, Adam started hearing of rumors of a deportation that would be happening in the Warsaw Ghetto, out of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he became very concerned for his family. He knew what this meant for his family. He knew this meant destruction of his family. So he began to create a plan to escape the Warsaw Ghetto. He had contacts in the Polish underground who gave him forged documents. He also had a friend who was a doctor. And together they came up with this pretty amazing plan of how they would escape the Warsaw Ghetto. This doctor injected their daughter Yasha with some type of drug that basically put her into a heavy sleep. They placed her body into a casket. They then placed the casket onto a funerary cart. And Pella followed this funerary cart to the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, the Jewish cemetery that is on Okopowa Street in Warsaw. When Pella arrived at the cemetery, there was a guard there because at this time, the Okopowa Street Jewish Cemetery lay on the border of the Warsaw Ghetto. The guard stopped them and wanted to open the casket to inspect it for smuggled goods. Pella told him, no, my daughter died of typhoid fever. He was very afraid of infectious diseases. He ended up letting them through. She had to tell a gravedigger that her daughter was actually alive to not bury her. And the gravedigger let her stay there until the cover of night when Adam could arrive. And they all went over the wall of the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw and escaped the ghetto and all survived. This is a picture of them from a DP camp after the war. This story is just one story of many I found in my past research where the Jewish cemetery was used by Jews as a site of survival. Jews used cemeteries to escape from ghettos, to hide from deportations, to smuggle goods into and out of ghettos, as was evidenced in their story. So a question that I came up with was, how did the Jewish cemetery become a space of refuge for Jews? But at the same time, cemeteries were utilized by Nazis as a part of genocide. Jewish cemeteries were destroyed, the gravestones taken to build roads and foundations of Gestapo buildings and to ensure riverbanks. And at the same time, Jewish cemeteries were used as sites of massacres, where Jews from towns would be taken to their cemetery to be killed and buried in mass graves. So then the question changed. How does the cemetery become a site for such opposing uses? On the one hand, the elongation of life, and on the other hand, the finality of death. And I don't believe that this question can be answered solely through an examination of the Holocaust. For this reason, my dissertation will be focusing on actually how cemeteries were used in both the interwar period and in the period of the Second World War. So for the interwar period, I'll be examining how Jews use cemeteries for ritual purposes, right? So burial processes, funerary processes, visiting graves of loved ones, as we see here in an image from the Woods Jewish Cemetery in 1938, and how these ritual uses might have been changing during this time period, during a time period that saw ongoing modernization and urbanization in Poland. I'll use digital tools to map Polish towns to see if this Jewish cemetery facilitated movement and interaction between a town's Jewish population and non-Jewish population. And I'm going to argue that the cemetery was a site where Jews wrestled with modernity and tradition, that the Jewish cemetery became a site where that actually enforced Jewish identity and Jewish community during this time. Then I'll compare it to how Jews used cemeteries during the war, during the Second World War. How did Jewish ritual use of cemeteries change because of the war? Were they able to access their cemeteries? This picture is from August of 1940 in Warsaw, at the same Warsaw Gopowa Street Jewish Cemetery. We see armbands already, but they were able to access the cemetery to have a funeral. But how did these things change because of the pressures of the war? Also, I will be examining Jewish responses to the Holocaust. The fact that the cemetery was used for escapes to hide from deportations. These are components of Jewish resistance, really, to the Holocaust, ways that they were able to find ways to survive through the cemetery. I will also be examining how the cemetery was a central space of murder and genocide, investigating those decisions about where the Holocaust took place can help historians answer questions about why the Holocaust happened as it did. Right? Finally, and I think another interesting story about this Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. My project will talk about ghettoization and the process of ghettoization, so the creation and establishing of ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in October of 1940, and this green line, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this green line outlines, this is the site of the Warsaw Gopowa Street Jewish Cemetery. And when the ghetto was first established, the cemetery was included inside the borders of the Warsaw Ghetto. However, about a year later, they changed the border of the ghetto. And they actually wanted to exclude the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery completely from the border, from the ghetto. They knew, Nazi authorities knew that smuggling was going on. They knew people were escaping through the cemetery. They wanted to exclude it altogether, but realized that they couldn't, that the cemetery was such a vital part of the continuance of the ghetto as it was because of the incredible number of deaths that were occurring. They needed the cemetery to actually bury these bodies. It became a way to keep, sanitary conditions in the ghetto. So actually, while the main space of the cemetery was excluded, the gate to the cemetery on Okopowa Street was actually the secondary border after this was changed in 1941. So what this means is that a couple like Adam and Pella Starkov could access this cemetery in the summer of 1942, just before the Great Deportation, and escape through the cemetery. One final note about the significance of this project is that I am trying to integrate Jewish history and Holocaust history here. I'm trying to do this through an analysis of space, the spaces of the Jewish cemeteries of Poland that Jews used in interwar Poland. These were the same people that were using these sites during the war as well. So I think that one way that we can integrate Jewish history and Holocaust history is through an analysis of space. And in my case, through an analysis of the Jewish cemeteries in Poland. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Morgan Morales, and thank you again for having us, Dr. Auerbach and Professor von Bernith. So unlike my colleagues, I will not be sharing a PowerPoint with you. As Professor Auerbach indicated, my project is about abortion during the Holocaust, and there are some things that are just a little bit more difficult to depict visually. So you're just going to have to listen to me speak, unfortunately, rather than having visual aids. But I'm actually really pleased to be going after Allison, because I think that there is a similarity between our projects in that Allison is, looking at Jewish cemeteries as places that were used by the Germans as part of further victimization, and then also used by Jews as part of survival. Similarly, I am trying to take the idea that abortion was used as something to hurt Jews and solely as something to hurt Jews, and instead arguing that it is a method of survival. But to begin, I really want to share 3 stories with you to indicate just how prevalent abortion was. So one of the ways in which the Holocaust entered into public memory in the United States was through a 1953 episode of the show This Is Your Life. The first non-celebrity guest of the show was a woman named Hannah Conner, who, almost every marker that someone could have as an experience in the Holocaust, she went to, from, emigrating to being in a transit camp, and finally where she ended up in Auschwitz, which she does not mention in her episode of This Is Our Life, and quite appropriately for 1953 television, is that while she was in Auschwitz, she had an abortion. The pregnancy was the result of her relationship with her then husband, Carl Benjamin, who did not survive, unfortunately. And she obtained this abortion with the help of a female friend and with the help of her brother, who found a doctor for her who was able to perform the procedure. A woman named Adina Blades-Schweiger wrote her memoir, I Remember Nothing More, and detailed that once she had escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto and was living on the Aryan side of the ghetto, that she embarked on a relationship with this man named Bernard. They were both looking for companionship, but as a result of this relationship, she found herself pregnant. Blades-Schweiger was herself a medical professional. She had worked in the Warsaw Jewish Children's Hospital, and somewhat similarly to Allison looking at these spaces, I will also be looking at the Warsaw Ghetto and these many spaces, which has a multitude of clinics, including clinics dedicated toward women's health. But to go back to Blades-Schweiger, she found herself pregnant, and she very succinctly and calmly explains in her memoir that she went and had an abortion. She could not have a child hiding in plain sight, more or less. She calmly told Bernard after the fact, and then she proceeded to help other Jewish women who were hiding in plain sight obtain abortions from the exact same doctor, a Polish doctor. And this is not just dangerous for the fact that she's having an abortion, but that she has to find a doctor who she can trust and who will not turn her into the authorities. And the third example is a woman named Dina Gottliebova Babbitt. She was imprisoned in Theresienstadt, and she was pregnant as the result of her relationship with her fiance, Karl Klinger. They both wanted children, but as she states in her testimony at the Show Visual History Archive, this is not an environment in which to have a child. They could not feed, clothe, or properly care for a child. And perhaps the most startling part of her testimony is her assertion that it happened all the time, it being abortion. So what I'm arguing in my dissertation is not simply that abortion is a method of survival, but that it's a method of survival that is based on a continuity of birth control practices that have carried into the interwar period. The interwar period was an era in which there was, a lot of discussion about birth control and about abortion, and a lot of activism about, whether or not it should be legalized, whether or not the criminal codes should be lessened. And this, of course, is going to depend on different countries. Specifically, if we're talking about Europe, the only place where abortion was legal was in the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1936. While abortion was illegal in Germany, it did have the most lenient abortion laws within all of Europe. So there's the fact that there are abortion laws should tell you that there are abortions happening, and there are. A historian named Tina Grossman estimates that at least 50% of women in Weimar Germany had had at least 2 abortions by 1925. It was that common. Further historians, Linda Gordon has written a book about abortion, particularly in the case of the United States. And her argument is that it is, the most common form of birth control that's happening. So it's not contraceptives as we might define them now, but it is a form of controlling birth. And in order to have an abortion within any environment, women are going to have to know where to go for that. They're going to have to know who to talk to, whether it's a female relative or whether it's a female friend, like Hannah Conner did while she was at Auschwitz, or whether it's being a medical professional herself, such as Adina Bladder-Schweiger, who knew who to go to in order to find someone so that she could procure this procedure. So to go in a little bit more to what this research is going to look like, and I'm just at the beginning of this project, I'm going to look at this in terms of space. The Holocaust is happening in all of Europe. It's a pan-European event. So I'm going to be looking at women who are in hiding. That includes women like Adina Bladder-Schweiger. I'm going to be looking at spaces such as ghettos, particularly Warsaw and Vilna. The Vilna hospital had a gynecological department, and the estimates are that over 300 abortions were performed there. That primarily the gynecological department there existed to perform abortions. I will be looking at Theresienstadt, which had one of the highest concentration of medical elite within all of the camp and ghetto systems that existed. Many of them had been brought in from Germany. So it's going to be, and then I will be looking at Auschwitz. And Auschwitz, it's an opportunity to look at practitioners. Much of the memoirs that we have are doctors who were there performing abortions. Among them, Gisela Perl and Olga Lengyel, who've both written very well-known memoirs. Gisela Perl wrote I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz, and Olga Lengyel wrote 5 Chimneys. There is a doctor named David Klebanov who estimates that he performed 40 abortions within one night on a Hungarian transport. And the reasons for this multitude of abortions are perhaps obvious. That you cannot be that a woman could not be pregnant while experiencing the Holocaust, what we now know as the Holocaust. There are not the resources to have a healthy pregnancy. And this is also a continuation of pragmatism, though in a very, very extreme environment. Women prior to the Holocaust are also having abortions because they cannot afford to feed, clothe, or shelter a child. So women are essentially relying on knowledge that they had before the war, and they're using that knowledge in order to survive. My final point is that this work fits into a growing literature on medical histories. I think quite inarguably, medicine is used to save in its purest form. We've seen from other instances in the Holocaust that it's used for very nefarious purposes. But at its purest form, medicine is intended to save. But by and large, the treatments on medicine in the Holocaust as life-saving measures either treat gender and biological sex as irrelevant categories, and that results in men becoming the default patients. So what does it look like when we look at something that can only happen to women and how they use medicine in order to save themselves? So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you, Morgan and Allison, for both of those talks. It's wonderful to see projects both in the final stages and at the beginning of research. And so it's wonderful to put all of these projects in conversation with one another, and exciting to do so. And I just have to warn you that my 4-year-old is coming in and out of my office, so I hope that's not too distracting. Okay, so our final group of speakers are focused on memory, memorialization, and commemoration of the Holocaust and the Jewish past. And I think that several themes from these 2 projects relate to previous ones, especially looking at Sephardic or the geographic regions of Europe that are part of Sephardic history, as well as sort of challenging prior assumptions about Holocaust memory and memory of the Jewish past. Our first of these 2 speakers is Alma Huselia, who is a first-year doctoral student in the Department of History. Before arriving at UNC, Alma was an intern at the European Roma Rights Center in Budapest and researched the impact of Yugoslav policies in the communist and early post-communist era on the housing insecurities of Roma in Serbia. And Alma is currently researching a local case study of World War II and Holocaust memorialization in Croatia, which is what she will be speaking partly about. And then our final speaker, I think, brings together the broader theme of our event tonight in terms of situating Jewish history and the Holocaust in one sort of broader picture, and reevaluating both issues in light of one another. So Oskar Czenza received his MA in Modern and Contemporary History from the University of Augsburg in Germany. He is the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships to support his doctoral research, including from the American Academy for Jewish Research, the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, and the Botziber Institute for Austrian American Studies. Next year, he will be a National Endowment for the Humanities Graduate Fellow at the Center for Jewish History in New York, with any luck if the pandemic makes it possible this year, next year. His doctoral dissertation is titled From Loss to Invention, Galician Jews Between New York and East Central Europe, 1890 to 1938.
Thank you, Professor Auerbach, for the introduction. Thank you again to the Center for Jewish Studies for holding this event, and thank you to everyone for coming. So let me just share my PowerPoint with you all. Just one second. Okay. So today I'll be talking about Holocaust and generally World War II memory in Yugoslavia, with my case study being the city of Varaždin, which is a city in the north of Croatia. And my initial research started by focusing on Yugoslav socialist memorials. Spomenici, and spomenik just means memorial, scattered throughout the region. And some are kind of semi-famous now due to their futuristic style, but most are dedicated to the victims of fascism and commemorate local battles, uprisings, tragedies, etc. during World War II. Usually the assumption, especially by those outside of the former Yugoslavia, is that these were national projects because they were built during the socialist period. But the opposite is really more of the case. Very few were nationally funded projects or were born out of national initiatives. Because of Yugoslavia's decentralized system of governance, most were actually the products of local initiatives, were locally funded or at the highest level funded by the republics. And actually lots of local industries were often instrumental in helping construct these monuments or being in charge of taking care of their maintenance after the fact. So it's not so much, as I see it, about understanding a state-imposed narrative about World War II and the tragedies during World War II, but more so local expressions of remembrance. And I chose Croatia more specifically as my focus within Yugoslavia because it was the location of Jasenovac, the largest concentration camp in Yugoslavia during World War II. And currently those estimated to have been killed in Jasenovac ranges between 75 to 100,000 people, 12 to 20,000 estimated to have been Jews, 12 to 20,000 estimated to have been Roma, and 45 to 50,000 estimated to have been Serbs, with also thousands of political dissidents from various ethnicities also being killed within the camp. Almost 80% of Croatia's Jews died during the Holocaust, either within its borders or whether they were sent outside of the country and ended up dying in other camps such as Auschwitz. And I turned to Varaždin specifically because it's a town with a historic Jewish community that was basically wiped out in 1941, and it was declared the first Judenfrei city in the NDH period. And when I say the NDH, that's just the Croatian acronym for the independent state of Croatia, which was the Nazi puppet regime during the years of World War II. And it was run by the Ustaše, which were the fascist Nazi collaborationists. But even before the war, there existed, from my initial research, there appears to have existed a Nazi presence in the town. These photos are from refugees from the failed 1934 July Putsch in Austria, and many of them left Austria and ended up in Yugoslavia, including in Varaždin. They were technically in camps, but these camps were pretty well accommodated and they became very well integrated socially within the town. A few years later, after they left, they ended up gifting the town a bus as a token of their gratitude for their time there. But then in the town, I was really struck by this World War II monument that was built in 1961. And it's built in kind of an unusual location for most Yugoslav memorials, in that it's built within the town cemetery. In contrast to lots of these memorials, as I showed on an earlier slide, they were kind of set inside of these natural landscapes and were supposed to be part of that scenery. And so I was intrigued by its location being so intimately located to family grave sites of people who have lived in this town for centuries and centuries. And that was even amplified by the fact that I found out that this monument is an ossuary and that bones from a prison camp during World War II located about 20 kilometers away from the town were interred inside of the monument. So about 15 years, because the monument was unveiled in 1961, you have this kind of ceremonial reburial of these victims of fascism. But my broader questions was who was included and who wasn't included in this local sense of commemoration. And I'm in the initial stages of my research, but I'm interested in the overlap between local narratives about World War II, as well as the state narrative and where those overlap and contrast with each other. And also the monument, I thought it was interesting is that spatially it's located very far away from the Jewish cemetery in town, which is on the outskirts of town. And because the Jewish population in town was basically eradicated in 1941, it dilapidated over the years because there was no one to take care of it. While this monument became really important in celebrating various socialist holidays during the Yugoslav period. And I have excerpts here. I've been working with a digitized newspaper archive from the town. And I just have here some excerpts from World War II era newspapers. And I think you can see my mouse, but I have right here an ad about checking Aryan ancestry, an excerpt about an article about confiscating Jewish property and valuables during World War II. And this is an anti-Semitic cartoon, which implies that the Croatians were enslaved by the Jews and now that they're cleaning their country from these parasites. And this is not these, but after the war ends during the socialist period, you don't have a mention of this past or the community's involvement with these crimes and who the victims of the Ustaše in the town and the surrounding areas might have been. And this doesn't seem, again, from my initial research, to be so out of line with aspects of the Yugoslav government's line on World War II. This is a photo of the Jasenovac monument, again, from this major concentration camp in Croatia. And it's one of the very few actually national Yugoslav monuments, but it's kind of abstractness and its vagueness in saying who were the specific victims of the Ustaše and that the Ustaše were actually the perpetrators of this crime because it was an Ustaše run camp. It drew a lot of criticisms from victims' families at the time. In Varaždin's newspapers, also because this monument was unveiled in 1966, I've been looking at the newspapers from that year as well, and they don't really discuss the dilapidation and abuse of Jewish spaces in the town, nor for Jasenovac's this memorial. And the day that it's unveiled, that week in the newspaper gets like a 2x2 inch insert in the paper just saying that there's a memorial. But these local memorials get like full page inserts. They have like weeks leading up to their unveiling. There's like these little ads like, oh, on this day it's going to be unveiled. And I just found this really startling because the Yugoslav government's like line on the amount of people killed at Jasenovac was about 700,000 people. So it's a massive tragedy that it's not getting so much attention in the newspaper. And so my questions are, why is this the case? So again, though I see these monuments as an aspect of local remembrance, they also contain aspects of forgetfulness or selective memories from these communities. And so some of the questions I'll be asking in my research are, how did the people of Varaždin remember the NDH period, the Ustaše and their victims? And how quickly did they accept the notion of unity and brotherhood with now the other Yugoslav constituent peoples, considering that a few years prior that they were specifically targeted, some of these groups were specifically targeted by the Ustaše during the NDH period. And of course, how did their children and later on their grandchildren also understand what the past? And these issues, I hope, even though I'm in the initial stages of my research, I hope that these topics are still very controversial in the former Yugoslavia. And I hope that I can shed light on the past through examining aspects of like a local community that went through all of this. So thank you again for listening.
Okay, thank you, Alma. Thank you, Karen. Thank you to the Center for hosting that event, also for funding our beautiful research projects. And also thank you to the audience for still holding through and not leaving the session. I promise I will make it as short as possible. so we have enough time for discussion and questions. So the big question of this panel is, how do our research projects inform our understanding of the Holocaust? And if we talk about the Holocaust, we speak about two ways. One about the past, the history of the Holocaust, the other one about culture, which is very much about the present. So how do we understand the symbols of the Holocaust, the memory of it, and the contesting meanings? And what I would try to do is to talk about the creation, the foundations of post-Holocaust memory, specifically the memory of Eastern Europe. So what do we understand under Eastern Europe? How do we remember the space of Eastern Europe? And what my project does is it looks at a very specific region in East Central Europe. It's called Galicia. Today it's in southern Poland, Western Ukraine. I will show a map later. And the image and the concept of this region that was created among a group of Jewish immigrants which came from Galicia and settled in the Lower East Side in the 1890s. And my goal is to complicate our understanding and our concept, what we mean under Eastern Europe, the label of Eastern Europe, and to show how fluid it is and how many different meanings this label, this category embraced throughout time. And I want to start with, against all the historical conventions, with the contemporary time, and to show this photograph of a former synagogue, which is today in Busk in Western Ukraine, so former Galician territory. And this synagogue is basically a symbol or a metaphor for contemporary American Jewish memory of Eastern Europe. We can see on the right part a ruin, so basically the beaten memory. And this is what I call with loss, so the memory of Eastern Europe defined by the trauma of the Holocaust, seeing Eastern Europe as a Jewish cemetery. And I'm not referring to Allison's project, but basically just as a space of death and trauma. On the left side, we can see half of the synagogue is renovated. And this is the aspect of invention. So the memory of how do we imagine Eastern Europe as a positive, as a place of Jewish persistence, of Jewish life. And everything falls into like nostalgia, or even Fiddler on the Roof and tradition and all these images we have, the positive images of Eastern Europe. And both of these types of forms of memory, loss and invention, are imaginations. And they are embedded in this picture in the very local reality of this shed. And I mean, there are no people, but maybe it belongs to someone. Basically, the local reality. And in my project, I'm dealing, and you will see this in a bit, with the clash between imagineers. How do people imagine a space they left, a homeland, and what is actually happening at the local reality? But before I move on, a map. This is some many versions of Poland. Red line, this is contemporary Poland. Green line is interwar period, 1920s and 1930s. And the blue part on the bottom, this is what former Galicia was. Galicia was an Austro-Hungarian province created by some Austrian bureaucrats in 1783, lasted a little bit longer than 100 years, and it got incorporated into the Second Polish Republic in 1918 after the First World War. And until today in Jewish culture, it bears many memories, also many stereotypes. So this is, okay, it doesn't let me, oh yeah. So that's a meme that I found on Facebook on this multiple Jewish genealogical groups that some of you might know actually in the audience. And there are stereotypes of the Galicianer and the Litvak and the Polish Id, so the Polish Jew. And as you can see in the map, like the Polish Jew is stereotypical. It's like not good, not bad. It's just an ordinary Jew. Litvak, better. He can actually read the Torah. He knows what the Mishnah, what the Talmud are. And the Galicianer, a little bit rich with a fancy mustache, with a hat. So here we have the Austrian heritage, basically. The German-speaking Jew is something better than the East European Jew. And I'm pretty sure it's been created by a Galicianer because there are other stereotypes of the very emotional Jew, the Galicianer Jew, as someone who doesn't think with his brain, but more with his belly, who eats everything sweet. And so there are a lot of different types of the stereotype. But what I want to show is this region, Galicia, is a very hybrid identity. It has German-speaking Austrian Jewish heritage. It has Polish Jewish heritage. It has Yiddish-speaking Hasidic heritage. So it's a very diverse culture, which complicates, again, our understanding of what do we understand under Eastern Europe. But let's move on to the interwar period, because this is basically my centerpiece of research, also of many of our research projects. So the memory of the interwar period is basically the key to understand our contemporary post-Holocaust memory, because we can already identify patterns of post-Holocaust memory. So for example, we have the aspect of loss again, trauma. So here we have the title page of a publication by Gershom Bader, who was an immigrant from Lemberg, today Lviv, who came to New York in the 1910s. And he published a collection of stories from Galicia in 1916 that are documenting the First World War, the destructions during the First World War, the Russians who came in. Later on, the pogroms, destruction. And we can see an iconography that is very similar to the iconography maybe some people know from the memorial books, Erskelbecher. So we can see dead bodies, crying women, an elderly Jew praying to God. We see fire, destruction in the background, and everything in front of a sea of blood. So we have iconography that resembles post-Holocaust memory, the trauma and the loss. On the other side, we have something that how American Jews imagined Eastern Europe. So we have here a cartoon, Litvak and Galicianer fighting over each other, and the caption says, the war on American grounds. So something from Eastern Europe has been transferred to the Lower East Side on American grounds. So it's again the imagination. This fight has been always in Eastern Europe happening, but most probably most Galician Jews have never met in their life a Litvak Jew in Eastern Europe. They met each other in New York. So this is again an American invention of Eastern Europe. And also it comes with all the defining of Lower East Side as basically a Jewish ghetto resembling Eastern Europe, this Hester Street and market basically in Eastern Europe. So these are again both both imaginations, loss and invention. And both of these imaginations are again meeting in the local reality. So we have the aspect of tourism. Jewish immigrants in the 1920s and 30s going to their hometowns, taking photographs with the local townspeople, as Julius Blackman, who was an immigrant from Shoften. He made some fortune in the United States, went back and to see his old friends and family. And here in this contact with the local reality, these imaginations clash with the poverty of the people. And for many Jewish immigrants, it meant the moment when they actually realized that we are Americans, we are not Galicians, we are not Litvaks, we are not East European Jews, we are actually American Jews. And you can see this in the picture, smiling, nice suit, and the surrounding is less happy, let's see. But there's a clash. And now I want to go back to the contemporary times. And basically, what I'm arguing is also that the key to understand our post-Holocaust memory, the forms and patterns lie in the interwar era. And this is also something that has been going through all of our research projects, like to try to create a Holocaust history that goes to the time before the Holocaust happened and to inform basically new findings in our research in the Holocaust. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alma and Oscar, and to all of you for sharing your research. We have, and especially to the audience for bearing with us and listening to us talk about this research. We have 5 questions, and I think we have about 6 minutes to answer these questions. And so what I'll do is I'll read out these questions, and there are I'll read out the questions of each speaker together. So Max, you have 2 questions. One is from Joseph Block. He wrote, you talk of post-1933 expressions of philo-Semitism, that is praise for the actions of Jewish citizens. Do you simply mean a persistent absence of anti-Semitic prejudice, or were there people post-1933 publicly proclaiming their special respect for the Jewish people? That's the first question, and I'll just read the second one out as well. This is from Paul Konuk, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Paul. How representative was the pre-war Jewish experience in Frankfurt? Was there any discernible difference in Jewish acceptance between the primarily Protestant North and Catholic South? Thank you to both of you for your questions. And if you could just keep your answers to about 2 minutes so that we can get to the others as well.
Even less than that if possible. Both great questions, thank you. To Joe, this question of philo-Semitism, more so, I guess, positive expressions about Jewish individuals rather than the Jewish people, sort of writ large right here. And also interestingly as well too, like in this work I'm talking about, or the first of these two, that's this history of Frankfurt during the First World War, there's some real cognitive dissonance going on, because you also will see sort of elements of Nazi ideology creeping in to later sections of this manuscript, which I've done some research on, was, you know, in process before the Nazis came to power. So it's sort of this question of like a kind of hangover effect going on right here. And to Paul's question, you know, that is a really, really, it's an interesting point how representative Frankfurt is of the larger experience. I think by focusing on a local level, what I'm trying to show is that it's hard to really speak of any kind of a uniform experience. So I would say that Frankfurt looks particularly rosy based on some of the things that I've seen compared to some other areas, you know, certain places such as Nuremberg, for example, that are early hotbeds of, you know, Nazi activity, for example, but not so far off from what you've seen in a place like Berlin, which is the, you know, the largest Jewish population in the country as well, too. So I'll stop myself there lest I go on too long and eat into other people's time.
Okay, thank you, Max. Just have a few other questions that I'm compiling here. There are several questions for Morgan. And the first is from Professor Christopher Browning. Thank you for being here, Professor Browning. And he wrote, "In my study of Strachowitz camps, only one woman testified to getting an abortion since it required a hefty bribe to visit a doctor outside the camp. But a number of women admitted to infanticide, though usually attributed to camp authorities, Jewish or German, not to a father or mother. How does infanticide fit into your study?" And then there are two more questions for you, Morgan, actually three more. One from Michael Green, how did the Orthodox deal with abortions? And Jeremy Ruthven wrote, Morgan mentioned that resources weren't available to have a safe and healthy pregnancy, but also were there resources for a safe and healthy abortion? Can you touch on the risk that was being taken medically to have an abortion under those conditions in those times? And then a last question from Lindsay Pullum. Abortion is a fascinating topic to think about historically, especially when it's so divisive in American and conservative cultures today. Do you foresee and will you address any connections of historical conceptions of abortion to modern day conceptions of the subject in your dissertation? So Morgan, feel free to answer the questions that, you know, together, if possible, synthetically, just for reasons of time.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you for the questions. We'll start with Dr. Browning. Thank you for engaging with this. I've considered infanticide. I'm not entirely sure yet if it will factor in. There are some tricky issues somewhat related to Lindsay's question, which I will go into now, of having to kind of work through what our perceptions of abortion and is now within a particularly American setting, which I will be acknowledging in my introduction, because, but the issue with infanticide is, you know, maybe not wanting to step into a specific minefield, and I haven't quite decided if I'm prepared to do that yet. But to go into Lindsay's question, it's going to be acknowledged in the introduction that to look at abortion the way that we have it framed now in the United States, which is so much more recent of a phenomenon, would be anachronistic to how abortion was perceived in this particular period. Jeremy, your question about whether or not a safe abortion could be obtained speaks a little bit to what Dr. Browning mentioned within his own research of the cost of having an abortion, and particularly about where someone would be and what they could potentially afford is going to impact how safe the procedure could be. So it's really going to depend. The prices of abortions vary considerably if one was going to see a doctor as compared to whether or not someone was going to see a midwife. But seeing a midwife does not necessarily mean that they wouldn't get excellent care, particularly since gynecology and obstetrics is a relatively new medical field at this point. So I hope that answers that. And Michael Green asked about rabbinical sources. There is a rabbinical responsa for this from Rabbi Ephraim Oshri, who was an Orthodox rabbi, who was in Kovno, and decided that it was all right for women to have an abortion in this case, because in this case, the pregnancy constituted a direct threat to her life. And that is in line with quite a few rabbinical writings about abortion for a couple of centuries before the Holocaust that would allow for an abortion should a woman's life be in danger. So thank you for the questions, everyone.
Thank you, Morgan. Ruth, do we have Rob? There's one question for Robin. Do we have time to ask that? Okay. This is also from Lindsay Pullum. With France serving as a new Sephardi center for Ottoman Jews, is there any indication about the relationship between these Sephardic Jews and Jews of the French Empire in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and North Africa in general?
Thanks so much for the question, Lindsay. I'll be brief. This is a really interesting question, and the answer is it's complicated. So in the interwar period, there weren't that many North African Jews living in the metropole itself, living in Paris. There were, of course, some, and they did have interactions with Ottoman Sephardi immigrants, really mostly among the elite, though, among sort of the lower working class. They had their own synagogues, they had their own oratories, and so those interactions were limited. But what's really interesting, I find, is that in the journals that Ottoman Sephardim printed in Paris, they talked about North African Jews, but they talked about them in a really sort of orientalizing way as this interesting and exotic other who needed their help with various, financial or communal projects, but that were really a different group entirely. And so they themselves sort of wanted to portray their Ottoman Sephardi community as closer to French Europeans. They sort of wanted to Europeanize their identity and had, sympathy for North African Jews, but distanced themselves from them using sort of racialized language that was common at the time.
Okay, thank you to all of you for your questions, to all of you for being here and commemorating the Holocaust in this way, and for listening to our students' research. And thank you especially to all of you, all of our doctoral students, for sharing your research and for pursuing such original and interesting work. So I will turn this over to Ruth, if there's anything that you want to add.
I just want to thank everyone who stayed with us. I want to thank especially all the panelists, and including Karen and everyone who presented and shared their research. And really, thank you out to everyone who we cannot see right now, but who supports us, supports the center, and supports this kind of research. We're really very grateful for this. And if you want to see what a recent graduate student did in his dissertation, a very different topic, then come to our next event with Brad Erickson, who will show a model of a 3D synagogue online. And I'm very curious how this will go over the screen. It will be definitely a different kind of way of presenting something. So one more time, thank you so much for coming, and have a great evening.
And thank you, Tyne, for taking care of all of the technology and organization for this event as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe, be healthy.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.